Welcome to Tell Your Story, the podcast. We are your co-hosts, Gene McIntyre, pastor and emotional intelligence coach, and Marybeth Steigenga, counselor and relationship coach. We believe that everyone has an extraordinary story to share. Together, we invite you to embark on a journey of self-discovery as we unravel the profound wisdom that lies in looking back to propel us forward. Prepare to be moved and inspired by tales of unwavering resilience, personal growth, and the pursuit of authentic living, including your own. Join us as we delve into the transformative power of storytelling. Because when you tell your story, you have the potential to change your life. And make sure to follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcast so you can be inspired. Good morning to all our audience. Welcome to episode 5 of Tell Your Story, the podcast. Here is my amazing friend, Marybeth Steigenga, relationship coach and counselor. And of course, me, Pastor Gene McIntyre. I'm a pastor and a life coach on emotional intelligence. And so, Marybeth, today we are, these episodes are like building blocks, right? We've spoken about our story. We've spoken about how we met. We've spoken about emotional regulation. And today we are going to talk about a very, very important topic, which is our story timeline. So I am going to pass it on to you so that you can tell our audience, what is a story timeline? What does it look like? And why do we need to have one?
All right. So I'm excited because this is, again, along with emotional regulation, I love to talk about story timelines because I do think it does let us know. It helps us identify where our themes and core beliefs and all that stuff that we're going to teach you how to do coming up. The first part of that is to actually take a deep dive into your story. And as we mentioned in both of our stories is you kind of have to look at your whole life, but when you actually are going to tell your story, when we ask you to join us on our podcast, is to pick, a couple of stories that are positive and a couple of stories that are negative, because obviously we all have many, many stories and it gets pretty complicated in there. So basically what you're going to do, and there's many ways to do this, Jenny, and I don't know how you did your story timeline, and you can share that with us in a second. But normally what I have people do when I'm working with them is I literally have a timeline, and we start at their birth and we go to their present age. And anything above the timeline would be a positive story, and anything underneath would be something that was negative or hard for them. And it can vary in degrees. They don't all have to be huge traumas, right? And they don't all have to be like, my parents took me to Disney and it was such a great experience. It doesn't have to be all great, but you want to log all of your stories that impacted you throughout your life. And it could be anything from I fell off my bike when I was 7 and broke my arm to I got the chicken pox. It could be, like I said, we went on a great vacation, or my birthdays were really good. One of my stories from when I was little is laying on my mom's lap and having her trace in my hair with a pencil. And she would do that quite regularly. So that was kind of a big story for me. But that was always such a way that I felt super loved. So
I love what you're saying, because I've heard you say that story in the years that we've known each other. I've heard you say that story several times, of like sitting in your mom's lap and having her play with your hair. And so I can tell how important it is to you.
Yeah, that's a big one for me. And even like having my sitting in my dad's lap in his rocking chair, like those aren't huge events in my life, but they were impactful to me, that I felt super loved and accepted and valued. So that's kind of how I do it, is to actually take the line and put like your positive stuff up and your negative stuff below. And then if you really want to get crazy, you can rank them by drawing like a line, like if it's a super positive, it would be a super above the line. And if it's super traumatic or hard, it'd be way below. And then the other ones, and it kind of gives you like a jagged little view of how your life goes. And then sometimes you'll have clients who they have most of their stuff is below the line, right? And so that gives you a good launch off is saying like, okay, how come all of your stuff is hard? Or I've had clients who minimize their story, their negative impact, and they don't have anything below the line. And my childhood was great. Everything was good. Everything was wonderful.
I love that you're making that distinction. Number one, because all our emotions are valid, right? Negative experiences, positive experiences, and the emotions that come with it. But as with everything, the key is in the balance, right? And I agree, like we cannot look at everything that happens to us as negative, 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 because it's not realistic, right? Even the most deplorable life has moments where there's joy and there's, but I tend to go there, right? I have a tendency towards being pessimistic, particularly in the last 2.5 years. So I tend to focus so much that you're right. Like if I were to do a life inventory right now, it might look a little off. But then on the other hand, like you say, there's that other extreme, which I call toxic positivity.
Yeah.
And it's toxic because it borders on denial. And we don't grow when we only focus on the positive things that happen to us. I tell my congregation all the time that adversity is to life and to our character what weights are to our muscles in a gym. They build resistance, right? There is an opposing force and it forces us to grow, to think, to self-analyze, evaluate, and whatever. But the second thing I want to say before I pass it over to you so you can continue talking about timeline is that I was smiling big when you were talking about how you do a timeline. And I was thinking about my book, and here's a complete shameless promotion, because as you know, I'm about to publish a book, and it's called It's My Life and I'll Cry If I Want to. And that book has to do a lot with timeline. There's a part of that book that is all about my life timeline. And Marybeth, you edited that book. And you know that my timeline doesn't look at all like what you're talking about. Mine goes from the past to the present, from the present to the past, and then I go to the future, and it's really like back and forth, back and forth. So I was just smiling, thinking about how you and I have so many things in common, but at the same time, we are so different, right? You're a more linear, structured person, and I'm more a chaotic thinker, right? I don't know if that's the right way to call it, but I was just smiling and thinking that that's one of the beauties of us doing this together, is that our audience can relate to both of us or to one of us better than the other, because we all have different styles. And at the end of the day, we are going to give you guidelines, but you're going to determine what works for you and what not. But I just love the order, the sharding, and I was like, oh, that's so not like my timeline. And yet, your timeline works for you, my timeline works for me, and ultimately that is what we need to do. We need to do what works for us. But continue. I love that you're leading this one.
Yeah, and yes, and you do. I don't want to put anybody in a box, right? Because you do have to find what works for you, and you do have to make it work for you. And so if being like super structured and linear is not your thing, don't do that. Then you can follow Jenny's. Then you can follow Jenny's thing. And sometimes you do have to even if you wanted to eventually get to the structured thing, you probably do have to jump around. I think you don't always remember all of your stories, and sometimes it helps just to start, I call it doing a brain dump, like just dumping it all on paper, and then you can go and maybe put it in some semblance of an order. If you're kind of an artsy person, and I'm not, I mean, I love art, but I'm not very artistic. You could do it in pictures. You could draw pictures of your stories and do it that way. So however it works is how we want you to kind of do it. And then once you do have your timeline or your story inventory, or whatever you want to label it, then you want to go in and kind of pick out, and you can look back to both our episodes where we picked out, 3 or 4 stories that were positive and then some stories that were negative. And you're going to pick those out, and those become what we were calling like our stories of impact. So really, what are the ones that really stick out to you in your life? And so you go back and say like, okay, for me, a super positive one obviously is the one with my mom and laying on my mom's lap. And my negative ones were a lot revolved around loss, because that was a major theme for me. And so if you look back at your stories, Jenny, what are a couple of the positive ones that jump out to you and a couple of negative ones?
I think establishing a relationship with God was a highlight in my life, because it happened at between 8.5 to 9 years old. And it was a huge break from my reality at home, which was very, very problematic. And, my time with God in prayer and in the Word became my escape. For an 8.5-year-old, that became my escape. And God remains to be my great escape route every time, right? But I learned to rely on God very, very, very early in life. I think after that, using my musical talents, like playing the guitar, singing, was huge. Learning that I had the power to write, and that God had given me, the ability to write and to use my words. Because then I never journaled, but I wrote a lot of thoughts in poems and songs, and that was very helpful. And advancing, meeting John, my husband, and marrying him, and of course, the birth of both my children. And finally, the realization after I met you and I started working in my life, the realization that I did not have to be like my mom. I did not have to be the type of wife that my mom was. I did not have to be the type of mom my mom was. And when I saw myself starting to change as a wife in how I communicated, how to treat my kids, particularly Astrid, who was already 5 years old when you and I met. So I could recognize that I had made some mistakes, right? And I didn't get better right away. So it was like a process. So by the time Astrid turned, 11, 12, 13, I could already see a change in me. And I will close with this. Probably the most powerful, happy moment in my life was when I said goodbye to Astrid to go to college. John was 2 weeks into his hospitalization. And I had been very worried about before I knew that John was going to be sick and in the hospital and die, I had been very worried about letting go of Astrid, like any mom, right? Of a teenager going to college. But when I was able to see her go and to encourage her and to be happy for her, although I was sad because my baby was going to college and my husband was in the hospital, which meant I was going to be left just with JC. And I was extremely sad, but still really wanted Astrid to go and start her new life. That for me was a graduation of sorts. It's like, yes, I am not a narcissist mother anymore. I'm not focusing just on what I need. I am happy. And I realized that I was experiencing the power of love. So that is by far one of the most amazing things that has ever happened to me, because at some point I didn't know if I had that kind of capacity. So that would be a few of the positive things in my timeline.
Yeah, those are all pretty amazing. And I do yeah, that sending your kids off to college thing. So I know you were worried. This is where we're different too. You were very worried about like how am I going to deal with that and sending my baby away. And I had it where I was like, go. I'm ready for you to go. Like, please go. But then I hit rock bottom. Like, I just was like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to survive this. Going up to it, I was like, get out. I'm ready for you to leave. But I remember when I sent my first son to college, I I spent the next like 3 hours crying because I was like, what have I done? What have I done? But so yeah, we have some different stories there. So yeah, so those are the positive ones. And you can then you develop, you can have like themes that come from your positive stuff too. Like I said, my parents taught me a good work ethic, and they taught me to persevere, and they taught me, to be kind and to love others. And so those were all positive things that came out of my upbringing. And it is important, I think, too, like you said earlier, even the hardest, most horrible stories, um, there is joy in there somewhere. There might not be a lot, but there are some stories that are positive. And so it is helpful to kind of label those and look at those too, when you're doing your story. And then on the flip side, you want to pick out the things that were hard that then caused you to form some of your core beliefs that were that are harder to process for you. So that's, like Jenny living in a chaotic home, not feeling wanted by her dad, her mom, who was a narcissist, who made her feel like she had to earn her love, and that type of stuff. And me having a lot of loss, not being so great in school and feeling like I'm not smart. Those are some of the things that and that people, like I have to meet other people's needs because people aren't available for me. So those are some of the things that came out of my harder stories. And so, yeah, once you have that, that's kind of like your basic framework for the inventory. And like we talked about in one of our last episodes, was you might have to do some of that emotional regulation while you're doing your story, right? Because it does bring up some things that are hard. And so you might have to do some of those techniques that we talked about.
Absolutely. Marybeth, going back to my book, which is probably the best product I have in terms of story timeline. When I was writing my own story, I literally had to stop several times to self-regulate. I mean, there were times where I had to stop writing and go on the floor and pray, or simply throw myself on the floor and cry, because I was revisiting my loss and my trauma. So it is okay, when you are working on that inventory, it is okay to feel angst and to face those emotions, and to then try to regulate your reaction to them.
Yeah. And you might need to get a coach or get a counselor to kind of help you process it and work through it, depending on what that looks like for you. It does help, I think, to have somebody normalize and validate a little bit for you, because sometimes you might even feel like you're going a little crazy at times. And so it's okay to have somebody kind of come along, or a good friend that can come along and kind of normalize that for you.
Yeah, I want to say something at this point, because I know that this is both very hard for both Marybeth and me. We're not natural self-promoters, but this is a good opportunity to say that Marybeth is a licensed counselor and a relationship expert. And so it is extremely important for us to know that if you need that kind of help, Marybeth is here. If you need that kind of help in the area of emotional intelligence or general counseling, or someone to listen, then I am here too. And we do this via Zoom, right, Marybeth? It doesn't have to be in person, right? And the reason I'm saying this is because I will never forget, I had a friend once that was talking to me about the wonders of essential oils. And she spoke to me for weeks about it. And I'm like, at some point, I'm like, do you know anybody that sells them? Like, I'm really, really interested. She's like, I do. But she had been talking to me for weeks, and never once did she say, you can get them from me. So I was this close to going to Amazon and buying essential oils when I had the person that sold them right next to me, because she was too embarrassed to tell me that she was actually selling the product. So we want to put our embarrassment aside, because we actually have a lot of experience in this area. And if you need help, we are here to help. And all you need to do is send us an email to the address that you saw at the beginning of the podcast and that you will see at the end of the podcast. And we will reach out to you and try to establish a relationship.
Yeah, for sure. Right. We don't do very, very good at
No, we do not.
promoting. For I say tooting our own horn. We don't like to toot our own horn very much, but yes, we do it for a living. So it is probably a good thing. And I think too, what kind of started this whole thing was your book, because I read your book, and not only does it have your story, but has many stories in it. And I was just overwhelmed with the power that these people had by telling their story, right, in your book. And I saw the transformation. And then I had done a similar activity in a training that I did. And I was like, man, we need to have everybody learn the power of this, of what it really does promote healing, and point out some things where you can grow. And so I think that's kind of what launched this whole idea in the first place. Okay, so we talked about our our stories, and then I think you and I were each going to share maybe an example of a story inventory from clients that we have worked with in the past, to give kind of an idea of what a story inventory looks like. So did you want to go first and give us your example?
Sure, I can talk about Marisa. Obviously, I'm changing her name for confidentiality reasons, but Marisa is a 19-year-old that I have been seeing since she is 17. Marisa came to me with a deep traumatic situation. And so this is the way that her timeline would look like. Marisa was born in a tumultuous environment. She was the middle child, and her parents had started having problems almost as soon as the eldest daughter was born. So by the time Marisa comes into the picture, her parents are already fighting, arguing all the time, and they even had another baby. So Marisa ends up being in the middle, but she ends up being neglected by her mom because she was too busy fighting with her dad, neglected by her dad because he was spending too much time hating on the mom who was being unfaithful to him. Marisa suffered great neglect also because the parents get a divorce, and then the mother moves into a duplex. And on one side, it was her lovers and her drugs. And on the other side, there were the little three girls. The eldest one taking care of Marisa and her little sister, right? Then at some point, because of drug abuse, Marisa's mother dies. So Marisa is forced as a minor to move and live with her dad, who lives in a complete different state and has since then remarried and has a little baby. So that's huge for Marisa because here she feels neglected. Her mom did a great job putting a lot of resentment in her heart towards her dad, although she herself was preventing Marisa from having a relationship with her dad. She badmouthed him. So by the time Marisa gets to move in and live with her dad and her stepmother, her heart is full of resentment and anger. And there's just a lot of hostility. And it didn't matter how much her dad and her stepmom wanted to do for her, Marisa was angry. And that is when I got her. And that is when we started working on this timeline, right? And she's now 19, and we'll talk in the next episode about how things have turned out for her, about the power of a timeline. But when I got her, she was extremely angry, extremely traumatized, and blaming the whole universe, but particularly her dad and her stepmom for how horrible her life was. And she also came grieving the death of her mom, who, although she had neglected her and in a lot of ways abused her, was the only parent that she had spent most of her life with. So that's a little bit of a timeline of Marisa's life.
Okay, so yeah, and I think too, an important thing to point out to listeners, if you feel angry all the time, that's usually a signal that there's something that needs to be healed in you,
For
right?
sure.
If you're spending your life wrapped in anger, that's your way of your emotions telling you, hey, you need to do some looking at what's going on
And
underneath
can
the
I add one more thing about that anger, Marybeth, which
Mhm.
was the truth with me? Another great indication of that you need healing is when your emotions can go from a 0 to 100 in a matter of minutes. Like in my case, it wasn't necessarily that I was angry all of the time, But girl, I could go from being calm to something happen, and it wouldn't be regulated. I would go from 0 to 100 in a few minutes, only to then, after the big blow up, go, what the heck just happened to me?
Happened. Yeah.
So if that's happening to you, that's a good sign that you need some coaching, some counseling.
Yeah, for sure. If you go from 0 to 100, and sometimes people do it in seconds, right? You can be
Yeah.
like a trigger and you go right over the edge. Okay, so I have a client that I have worked with. She's we'll say Susan, because I'm gonna change her name. She grew up in a home that was very I mean, her parents were married. She had 5 siblings. She was the middle, but never had enough to eat. Dirty clothes, dirty house. Her parents were hoarders. Her dad was an alcoholic. Um, and yet, in the midst of all of that, she really took on the role of caring for the younger kids. And her older siblings kind of were not involved, but she was kind of in that role. And but the joy that came in her life is she had a really good friend whose mom kind of adopted her, for lack of a better way of saying it. And so she spent a lot of time over at this friend, and she actually calls this other lady her mom now, because that woman introduced her to the Lord, which, was, she says, like, saved her life, and showed her what like love was and what a real family looked like, and how to be, successful and have a clean house and all of those things that she was missing at home. So they actually were removed a couple of times by child services, only to be put back. And so she had this very traumatic upbringing, and but had made the decision, like, I'm not going to be like that when I grew up. So she kind of took all of that trauma and stuffed it, and became like a super overachiever, really successful in her career, got married, had 2 kids, all of that good stuff, but stuffed all of that trauma. And how it came out for her was like crippling anxiety almost. Was she'd be having panic attacks and didn't know, like, she's like, my life is good now, I don't know what's going on, why am I feeling like so anxious? And she'd be driving in the car and have like a panic attack. So so she got into some counseling, and we can talk about the power of telling your story with her at a different time. But she was able to identify, oh, this is all from that stuffed trauma is now coming out into my life today.
Beautiful, beautiful. Marybeth, I think something that would be a great idea would be to include a kind of like a guide, a link to what a timeline looks like. Probably much better if it's developed by someone that actually believes in structure and order like you.
I was gonna say, I hope you're gonna volunteer me for that, because do you know what I find very therapeutic is making up like forms and handouts for people.
I
So
know you do. And you
yeah,
prepare the best.
so I love to do that. So I will put together something, and then we will put that up where you guys can find it and
Yep.
use it for your
Yeah, it will
benefit.
be in the description to this video. And if you are listening to this as a podcast, then all you need to do is go to the YouTube video version of this in our YouTube channel, and you will find the link there. Marybeth, recapping, what would you say are the benefits of having a story timeline?
So I think the benefit is it helps you identify different themes and core beliefs. For me, that was the biggest benefit, as I realized, like, oh, because of the things that happened to me, this is the way now my brain processes the world. And so some of my actions and behaviors became clear to me. And I think, like you mentioned earlier, is you were going from 0 to 100 in 37 seconds. And it was a result of some of the unresolved trauma in your life, right? And so helps to be able to identify some of these things, and so that you can start the healing process.
Beautiful. And so, friends, we are going to leave for now, but we are going again to drop that timeline, and we invite you to do that because you should be by now emailing us and letting us know that you want to be in this podcast, that you want to actually jump in with us and share your story. There is power in your story. And so a great way to start doing that is by writing your story timeline, right, Marybeth?
Yes, for sure. And be telling all your friends about the podcast so that they can learn all about the power of story as well.
Absolutely. I guarantee you that there's people, just as there are people in my life and in Marybeth's life that need support, that need encouragement. There are people in your life that need encouragement and support. So do not be afraid to tell your story, and do not be afraid to start working on that timeline.
Right. All right. Well, then I guess that wraps it up for this episode, and we'll see you guys next time.
We'll see you guys next time. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.